Sounds like we're live.
We are live.
Well, hello everybody. This is the Two Guys, One Cup podcast again, coming at you like 5 weeks later. We're talking about determinants today, Chapter 2 of Ray Dalio's Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order: Why Nations Succeed and Fail.
Before we get started here, go and show these guys what you're drinking over here. Show them what you're having.
Oh, that's a good idea. I'm having some Screwball. Tastes like peanut butter.
And I'm having a little single malt Japanese whiskey. So I guess we'll cheers.
Virtual cheers this time.
Virtual.
I would say Screwball is definitely a whiskey or a bourbon you should drink. I'm not sure which one it is. If you don't like whiskey or bourbon.
It's an easy sip, and it's sweet, and like you said, it tastes like peanut butter candy. So at the end of the day, it's good stuff. But let's get into it. Let's get into this thesis here.
Yeah.
What are your takeaways here? Page 57, I see, is the first little bit here.
Yeah, page 57 is the first chapter or first page of chapter 2. And Ray Dalio kind of sort of lays out his thing at the beginning of the chapter, and one quote that kind of does that outline justice is, "I have learned that history's continuously evolving story transpires like a perpetual motion machine that is driven by cause and effect relationships that both evolve and repeat over time." So that's kind of the overall framework that he's setting us up for.
So I guess, would you say that you agree to that statement, or do you say that you disagree to that statement on a broad level?
On a broad level, I would agree with that statement. Like, there are cause and effect relationships, and they are relationships. Like, a cause just isn't a cause. It can also be an effect, which we learn throughout the rest of the chapter, of like that kind of details those cause and effect relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And they do repeat over time, and there are main relationships that drive like history, like what we look at is the most important things, or through an economic lens, or whatever that may be. How about you?
I think I agree to it. I think that there's a lot just throughout history, from a history standpoint, that he was mentioning there. I think that it definitely does make sense. Obviously we've had a lot of unprecedented things, and especially recently, that are, our global banking system is so different than what it was, 50 years ago, 20 years ago. So it's one of those things that I think throughout, if we're talking about the history perspective, I think that it's absolutely true. We evolve from things, and we adapt and change based on our experiences, but at the same time, those same situations do occur over and over again throughout history. So I from a historical perspective, I'm in full agreement there.
History certainly rhymes. So the main part of this chapter is the determinants, those cause and effect relationships. And like kind of going through the determinants just on page 64, I was looking at, we're mostly looking at economic, financial, technological, military, geographic, political, governmental, cultural, and natural phenomenon, which essentially is kind of what, if we group all that together under one umbrella, that's kind of like history or current events, or what we might think of as the future. Right?
Yeah.
Um, and one big like kind of underlying assumption is that these phenomenon can be modeled and understood, which I think makes sense, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I
Like,
mean, people it's difficult to model these things, but, it's possible.
yeah, like most things in the world, like an actual machine, like a car, for example, you can model and understand it, even if there's a bunch of things going on at you know sizes as small as the atom up to big old 5 liter Mustang engine. We can model and understand those things.
Sure. Yeah, agreed.
um my main critique to this, and I don't know if you agree with this, but it's like the perpetual part of this machine. Because that, like, he only mentions it a couple of times. He actually mentions the word perpetual throughout the chapter,
Mhm.
which makes me think that, like, this is a pretty deep assumption, like, under his model. But the perpetual part of the perpetual motion machine means that it's gonna keep going, like, forever without any additional energy put in from the outside, if we look at it from like a thermodynamics perspective.
Mhm.
And like, if the machine isn't perpetual and Ray Dalio says it is, like, the model could be good for a little while, but eventually the the reality in the perpetual model will diverge if humanity isn't perpetual, which I don't think it's out of my mind to say it isn't, with us being on the doorstep of World War III.
Sure. I mean, I agree, but the way I read it was more of in the sense that, it is an assumption, and I do agree that it is an assumption that he is saying that, perpetual implies that this machine is going to continue to operate and run with these same inputs forever, and that very much, I agree that definitely is an assumption that he's making, but I think that the context that I got was more history is the past. So from what I saw in that statement was that up until this point there has been traceable and, you know readable patterns within human history, with those cause and effect relationships that has continued for this long, right? So I agree with that piece. I think that, yeah, like, absolutely, things have gone this long, but at the end of the day, it isn't also out of your mind to assume that if it's been this way until now, it's going to continue to be this way.
Yeah.
So, even with the evolution and repeating history over time, like World War III isn't prime example. Obviously, we're hoping that doesn't happen, but it's a prime example of something repeating. It's like the Cold War all over again, essentially, right now. But now there's several different parties here, not just one. And on top of that,
Are
it's
you
also
saying Ukraine is a party?
they're a party that's on our side, quote unquote. Yeah, we'll see about that. But the repeating over time, I mean, the evolution part as well. Like, it's also an opportunity for the world to basically have a new chance to evolve our practices, evolve the way that we, our relationships with other nations. And, the Cold War taught us a lot of lessons and we learned from those lessons, but we also failed at adapting to a lot of these lessons. So it repeated itself. So now it's another opportunity to basically adapt and change. So that's kind of what I think.
Mm. That does go. leans into like the human inventiveness determinant that
Hmm.
uh, Mr. Dalio talks about later on. That, if I remember correctly, it's like if we look back on history, this is certainly true since we're still around and we're like humanity's richer than it's ever been. It's more like the population is larger than it's ever been.
Sure.
Um, but humanity's inventiveness, our ability to solve problems, has always been larger than the problems themselves.
Right.
I kind of feel like that has to be the case
Yeah.
for
No. Agreed.
us to have started at like, I don't know, like 2 humans to go to 8 billion and
Yeah.
live a lot better.
But you did say richer than we've ever been. Another thing that he mentioned was also the disparity, wealth gaps. That's another thing he mentioned within the how individuals and groups interact with each other. I think it's page 75. He mentioned about this wealth. So yeah, I mean, humanity as a whole is a lot richer, but 8 billion people, you got billions of people who are in, destitute poverty around the world. So it's like, yeah, our society as a whole has grown more prosperous over time, but when it comes to people in, the Congo or in South India or whatever, these people are still incredibly poor. And in fact, are probably living, because of the nature of industrialization and all of that, probably living in worse conditions than they would if this was pre-modern times and they were
Mm,
poor then. We don't know because we can't analyze. We don't have data from, Babylon and these things is showing how these people live when they were really poor. But it's an important point to make. That people are still very destitute these days.
yeah, I mean, I would agree with you like on the Congo thing. Like they're using like slave labor, right?
Yeah,
They're actually mistreating their human capital,
right.
which is kind of one of the large determinant classes that
Hmm.
countries have. I asked uh Chat GPT about human capital because it's like kind of defined on page 70,
Yeah,
but it's not very clear what it is. It just didn't really have like a good one sentence definition, but here's what ChatGPT said. The phrase human capital refers to the skills, knowledge, and abilities possessed by individuals within a society that can be used to create economic value.
right.
Uh, and then it goes on to say, and I think this is what your Congo comment made me think of this.
Hmm.
Uh, empires have neglected, or empires that have neglected their human capital have typically struggled to keep up with changing times and have eventually fallen. These societies have often relied on exploitative labor practices and have failed to invest in education and training.
Yeah,
These empires have fallen behind in terms of innovation and economic growth, just like on average.
that's
Um,
interesting though, because I don't know, because I feel like that statement is not all that accurate. Because at the end of the day, like, I got two examples. The first is going to be the United States, because we had obviously that the infamous period of slavery here in the US. Not, it was a dark time for a lot of people, but that they exploited people, but at the end of the day, going back to that adaptation, they moved on. We moved on as a society from that. And obviously that gets into, did we really move on from it? All this stuff, things, societal factors and race and all these other things that go into it. But at the end of the day, the point is that the United States became more prosperous on a global stage and more self-sufficient after that period ended.
mm,
Same thing goes with with in Europe as well, the same thing. The same when they were conquering I mean, I guess it could go either way, but when England was at its peak, I mean, it wasn't really slavery, it was more colonialism, but they used the people and they became extremely prosperous from it. So, I think that it is less prosperous. I think that I would agree with that statement if instead of the empire controlling it, they were talking about if a sovereign nation like the Congo knew that these things were going on and continued to basically aid and abet a form of slavery in modern times. Just like how in West Africa there was a lot of cases of warring tribes basically selling other tribes that they beat in battle to slavery. When that happens,
Mhm.
that leads to crumbling in just the societal fabric because then there's a lack of human morality anymore. So I think that it's more applicable to the actual nation of the Congo than it is to China because they're doing pretty well from it. They're making a lot of money from it. So at the end of the day, China's not suffering. You know what I mean?
Does China have like slave labor right now? I mean,
In the
they
Congo, I
kind
think they own most of the mines in the Congo, like mostly all of them, if not
yeah,
all
and
of them.
I think about also the Nike factories and stuff
Sure.
like that. Pretty
Yeah.
sure, a few months ago, maybe it was a couple of years ago, there was a whole thing about Nike,
Hmm.
basically having slaves.
Yeah. Pretty
So
much. I mean, it's one step away. You're paying them minimal amounts of money, and at the end of the day, when you control and have a vice over that country's economic system, because your company's the only country, it's the only company creating revenue there, creating any sort of GDP, then at the end of the day, that's what's going to cause for these things to happen, and people are relying on it. They need to work. They can't say I can't work.
so let me ask you this. Does exploitative labor practices only result in prospering if there's kind of that like self other relationship with the labor that's being exploited? For example, in the US's case, like the black people who were slaves, they I mean, for a time weren't thought of as like people,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
That's like why they weren't allowed to vote and stuff like that. Um, and I know in China, I don't know if like I know there are self versus other relationships
Hmm.
in there. Like if we're talking about China and the Congo, that's pretty obvious, right? The
Right.
self is China and the other is the Congo because they're separated geographically. They have skin color differences just like the
Cultural,
US.
everything.
Yeah.
It's like two different peoples. Yeah.
Um so while these empires kind of relied on exploitative labor practices, it was kind of coming like the exploited labor kind of wasn't a part of the empire, right? Like the self part of the empire. Does that make sense?
So are you saying within, for example, going back to the US slavery situation, so you're saying that it's not a part of the empire because we deemed these slaves as others, as people who are not included in our society?
Yeah, like we didn't have to worry about like feeding them or like making sure they were culturally involved or
Yeah.
educated. We had the self. The self was being educated, like all the northerners and all the plantation owners, like they
Hmm.
had to be educated to coordinate a labor force, even if they were exploiting them. Um, but like the other part is like I don't know. Maybe it's exploitative because it's kind of that self versus other complex. But I mean, to me, it seems like the slaves were like treated as like tools, right?
I mean, pretty much. I mean, it's very Machiavellian, and it's like it's a means to an end. Like they're using these people as, yeah, a tool to achieve whatever that they're trying to achieve. But at the end of the day, when it comes to integrating them into society, like no way, in their
Yeah.
minds, it was like no shot. We're not going to do that. And also, you had an interesting point about China with the self and other. And I had a conversation with my father the other day, and he was telling me that like literally almost the same exact thing. He was saying that like, but China, to further that statement, in China, there's a very strong perception of, and whether that's because of propaganda or whatever, that's a different conversation, but they have a feeling of the us, that like China as a collective is one and everybody else is another. Everybody
Mhm.
else is pretty much, even within China, even like you got Chinese
Yeah, you
nationals
gotta
and
be
even
Han Chinese,
right.
right?
You need to be, yeah, exactly. You cannot be Tibetan. You cannot be a Uyghur. You cannot be one of the traditional steppe peoples who used to live in, the Mongolian region, all that for the longest period. Can't be one of them. You have to be Chinese, not only nationally, but ethnically. And it's a very interesting thing because they view everybody else as almost, I don't want to butcher his words, but yeah, almost as in like a rival or an opponent.
Mm,
It's them versus everybody else, which is a very interesting thing because, in a lot of senses, if you have the means to do so, when you have that mentality as a collective and you basically sell that concept to your people, you can either implode or you can become very prosperous, one or the
mhm.
other. And they're clearly on the second one. They're doing very well for themselves. So I just wanted to make that point because that came to mind when you mentioned
Yeah.
the self and other.
Yeah, it's interesting, like, how ChatGPT could give such nice sounding answers. Yeah, you dig, you scratch a little on the
Yeah.
below the surface, and then you're like, "Well, is that really real? Is that really accurate?"
And it's funny, like they have, because ChatGPT also has bias as well. Like you say certain things to them, and ChatGPT will not respond in a purely, which I think is being framed as like a purely objective, medium. It's not at all, at all. So it's very interesting that it said it and phrased it in that manner because that's not an objective reality. Because it's not. A lot of countries have imploded because of exploiting others. Because like when India revolted, that was pretty much the end of the British Empire as we know it, and they were never the same. But also, you have cases where people have prospered like crazy off of exploiting other people. Like it's a mixed bag, honestly.
Yeah, yeah.
That's where
Um,
those other determinants kind of come in and determine whether or not that country's actually going to implode or whether it's going to continue to grow.
yeah, yeah, and I we've been talking about for a little while all the problems that humanity has with, like, slavery and class struggles and stuff like that, and it brings me back to the point that it's like this machine isn't perpetual. And if we look at the data that this model was generated by, we can I think it's fair to say, like, if you compare the age of humanity versus the age of the universe or even just the age of the earth,
Hmm.
like, humanity hasn't been around for more than 1% of either of those time periods, the universe in existence or earth being around.
Right.
And, like, I don't know how old humanity is. I think some people, like, what are we? How
I
old
got
are
you.
we? Like 10,000 years?
200,000 years.
200,000? Pretty close. So the data for Ray Dalio's perpetual conclusion, it comes from page 59. He says this: 11 leading empires over the last 50 years, 100 years of data for the 20 most important countries in the last 100 years, and then the major dynasties of China over the last 1400 years. So, one thing is for sure we're not even analyzing 1% of the 200,000 year human data.
Right.
Add on to that the millions of years that Earth has been around, if you go by the rocks and the carbon dating, and then the whatever billions of years that the universe has been around. I don't think it's fair to say at all that humanity acts like a perpetual motion machine if nothing else in the universe acts that way, and
Right.
we only have a small sliver of data to say that.
You know, it's interesting. Yeah, I just asked ChatGPT, "Will humanity end?" to see if there's an end to that perpetual machine, and it says, and I'll paraphrase. It said quite a bit here, but it says like it starts off with, "As an AI language model, I cannot predict the future with certainty." First thing. So, and then it also says, um, it talks about some threats like natural disasters, wars, yada yada yada, and then it says, despite these potential threats, humanity has survived and thrived for thousands of years and continues to make progress in areas such as science, technology, and medicine that can help mitigate any of these risks. Ultimately, the future of humanity will depend on many factors, including our ability to address the challenges we face and work together to create a better future for ourselves and future generations. Very interesting.
Very safe answer.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's a very interesting answer. It's like, okay, huh. But,
just say yes or no.
yeah, I mean,
Damn
but
it.
it's interesting. I will say that when it comes to the perpetual kind of motion of history, I've been listening to a lot of history related podcasts recently, and I think, and this is a very broad statement, but I think the more you know and understand about historical events and what has gone out, what has, occurred in the thousands of years of human existence and different eras of time, periods of time, not just Western, but throughout the world, I think that is necessary to be able to even have a clue as to how things will progress now. And even then, I don't think, and even if you're trying to model it, you can't. It's like modeling like financial data. Like, yes, you can model the past and what has occurred, and you can make an estimated guess towards the future. But at the end of the day, a simple occurrence like a leaked conversation with a in the financial, for with that example, like a leaked conversation with an executive could alter a stock price, although it was forecasted
Mm.
to go up. And next thing you know, one small event, which is completely independent of all of it, could impact whatever forecast that you had for the future by a lot. So it's like one of those things where it's like, it's almost impossible to tell if, this is going to continue to go on perpetual motion or not. It just depends on your belief system, which is, kind of another one of those determinants that that Dalio mentioned.
Yeah. And I mean, what the belief system of I think Ray Dalio, when he talks about beliefs, it's in the values and culture section.
Yeah.
That's page 75 and 73. And I mean, I think we both know this to be true. Like, religion has a huge impact on relationships between people, like just two individuals. It goes between two churches, like two families, two communities, and it scales all the way up to like multiple countries being at like constant, just like war with one another, like in the Middle East.
Right.
Um, and I know for me, like my belief system, like in the Bible specifically, uh, impacts how I like view this thesis, how my relationship with Ray Dalio. And when I read his thesis, the thing that instantly came to my mind, again, about the perpetual part of his thesis, is Matthew 24, verse 22. And to give context to this verse, this is in uh Jesus's Olivet Discourse, which is pretty much his last sermon before he was crucified, and he was talking about what the signs were going to be and what the world was going to be like when he comes back. And it says this, Matthew 24:22. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. Um, to me, this indicates that, like, so if we zoom out a little at the whole Bible, we know when Jesus comes back, it's like described by Revelation and stuff. There's going to be a lot of stuff that goes down. There's going to be like acts of nature, like huge earthquakes and storms and stuff like that. And then there's also going to be wars and persecution and stuff like that. It's going to end up killing a lot of people. And Jesus here is basically saying God is going to, like, intervene by sending his son back to earth so that humanity essentially just like doesn't kill itself, or die from all the acts of nature. So it's pretty interesting.
Yeah. I would say that definitely interesting, but what came to mind was the fact that similar to what I said earlier about the financial information, like knowing some sort of, information that is not available to other people that might influence your decisions. Same thing would apply there, right? Because people who opt in to that religious belief or the religious beliefs, I'm sorry, of the Jewish religion or of the Muslim religion, your perception of what is going on currently will be changed by your analysis of your belief system, the
Mhm.
Bible, whatever. So, and people make their own reality. So at the end of the day, if us as a society, if we had a country that fully believe that, 100% Christian or 100% Jewish or whatever, 100%, not even a smidge of
Mhm.
anybody else, and they thought that some sort of the end of the world was coming, you would see that country basically reacting to that new information in a very strong manner. And
Yeah, it's a pretty
that,
extreme belief.
right, and that could cause downstream impacts if the end was not actually happening at that time, right? So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that belief systems, the it's an advantage and a flaw, but it causes almost a sense of groupthink that can alter how we react to new information and new stimuli approaching us, especially when it comes
Mhm.
to the end of the world. I think just in experience, you see all these, you talk about crazy like conspiracy theorists and whatever, all these people. If they think of World War III is going to happen, they're going to buy all this toilet paper, going to buy all this beans, and they're going to hunker down. And if it doesn't happen, then what? You know what I mean? I don't know if you really get what I'm trying to get at, but pretty much if you opt into that belief and you think that the end is coming and you think the end is tomorrow, then your reality is changed. Even if objectively the end is not tomorrow, if you believe that it is, then you
Mhm.
will react to that information, to your truth, not to the overall like perception of what's happening. If that, I don't know if
Yeah,
that makes sense,
I
but
think
I'm
it
trying to be
it
concise.
it does make sense. And one thing I like that you pointed out that reminds me of something from a podcast I listened to today. Um, it's the Part of the Problem podcast. The host was on Joe Rogan like a while ago. Anyway, but Governments now, like the US government, for example, is like a really huge ship. You know, we got a lot of people, a lot of momentum, and it's really hard to steer it.
Right.
And one of the powerful things about um a belief system like a religion like Christianity that changes the self-interest. So that's one of the determinants Ray Dalio was talking about. I believe there's a really good graphic. Yeah, there's a really good graphic of it on page 82. So the belief system of Christianity, for example, is kind of like the self-interest is in God and humankind, right? Those are kind of the two main ones. And if you have that belief system, everybody subscribes to it, and there's some sort of like shift in that really like closely held belief system, then you can turn like even a giant ship like pretty fast.
Sure.
So I think like you said, you know, there's pros and cons with that.
Yeah, and I would say the only thing is that, with that example, if we had that as our system that we operate by, like Christianity, for example, then ideally, then you would have just like with his statement, how history repeats itself and how we adapt. If that was the case, then there must have been some, at least in recent history, some level of a successful theocratic system in place. And so far, we do not have that at all. Because the issue that people see with theocratic systems is that, yeah, we all subscribe to this belief system, but we also all have to subscribe to this belief system. And we also cannot say no. And we cannot say, oh, I actually believe this part of this and this part of this, but I don't
Yeah.
believe this, or I believe in something else entirely. At the end of the day,
That
I don't.
and one thing I want to say,
Mhm.
one thing that makes that a huge problem is when that theocratic system gets corrupted, because now you can't even have like legitimate uh like concerns with the belief.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that just happens whenever belief systems comes in contact with government authority and having an ability to actually impact people's lives, and you have that much power. Then at that point, you see, like in Europe's history, the power of the Pope and how that adapted over years. The fact that the Pope was once almost like a warlord, like he had pretty much all of Europe's true. It was no empire, but just through Christianity, he was able to command all of Western Europe's available forces, all of their troops, and he had control pretty much over their political systems. You
Oh
know,
yeah.
so at the end of the day, it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, it's nice in an ideal world to have it's ideal if you believe in that belief system, but it's ideal to have a situation where the government is navigating in a Christian manner or a Muslim manner or a Jewish manner. But at the end of the day, it doesn't work and it never has. And we need to, I think the United States is very strong in the sense that we not only allow but encourage diversity in religious belief, because people do have a right to believe in what they believe in, and we shouldn't operate as a nation. I think it's selfish in any manner to say that our nation should progress in a, again, whatever X religion manner. I think it's a little selfish when it comes to the other people who are like, well, I don't subscribe to this entirely. There's pieces, like I'm sure Jewish people subscribe to pieces of the Christian faith, but they don't subscribe to all of it. And they probably would not want to live in a society that is run by in a Christian manner, because that's not their belief. They don't believe in it.
Yeah. I
So,
guess it's selfish unless it's true, right?
I mean, it's I guess, but that's something that we have no right as, and again, it's a little bit different, but I just don't think that people have a right to inflict. or not inflict, that's the wrong word, to, what's the word where you push something? Let's say push. That people don't have a right to push a system onto others just like that, just because they can.
Mm.
I don't think that that's something that is acceptable in any form. You know, even if you're right, like if there's a bomb going off, there's a nuke going off, and everyone knows it. And again, back to the thing, you can believe what you want. You make your own reality. If there's someone like, no, 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 there's no bomb going off. Come on, like, come on, sirens are going off, and he's like, no,
Holocaust
no
isn't
way,
real.
no, like, there's no way, like, there's no way. Still, you know,
They'll get blown up.
they're making the damn decision that they want. You
They'll
know,
get
like,
blown up. Reality is reality.
exactly, but at the end of the day, it is still, if that bomb is going off, it is their responsibility to take care of them and their own. So there's no way that you will be able to or should control somebody else's actions. If they want to be ignorant, they can be ignorant. And that can be for anything. And it doesn't have to be just religion. And I'm not saying that the Christian faith is right or the Jewish faith is right. I'm just saying that at the end of the day, we have no compunction to enforce something on somebody else if they don't want to believe it and they have their own beliefs.
I would agree. It's not like, to me as well, it seems like I shouldn't be able to impose my beliefs or my standards or what I want onto you. And you
Sure.
shouldn't have to abide by them unless you feel like there's a good reason to.
Right.
You know, like if maybe I'm paying you to do something, like be on this podcast, for example. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. Not
um,
getting paid.
but
Not getting paid.
it is interesting that, like, you know, while humans can't always impose their beliefs, like some try, nature, or if you want to call it God, you also can, um will always impose her belief on uh humanity, on you, right?
Sure.
Like, uh acts of nature was talked about on page 69, and what we saw, Ray Dalio brought up like the Black Death,
Hmm.
and apparently it killed a lot of people.
Yeah. It killed, like, I think it was like a fifth. Let me check this. One.
So I already did the math, don't worry. Black Death killed 75 to 200 million
Mm.
in the years around 1350, and I looked up the population in 1350, and I believe it was like 370 million.
Okay.
So what that means is the Black Death killed between 20 and 54% of the world population in 1350.
Well, that's it.
And
You're close because what I saw online was it killed between 30 and 60% of all Europeans.
maybe like Europeans were like most of the world
Well, I
in
think, well, they were hit the
1350.
hardest for sure also because they had the most, like, development in terms of, like, cities and stuff. So I think
Yeah.
when they talk about the world, I think a lot of the metrics that they used back then, Europe was the world. So at the end of the day, there was nothing else, so they don't really know.
Yeah. And I just wanted to bring up that
Mhm.
that is the equivalent to between 2 and 4 billion people dying today. But if we factor in like how contagious the Black Death was, how like
Right.
serious the illness was, and we factor like how densely populated some of our
Yeah.
cities are, and I mean, even the world psychology today, if someone if the US tried to lock down like anywhere, like I don't think most places would do it. I
Yeah,
think
but
we're
I
kind
don't
of
know,
over it.
dude. With the Black Plague, like, when people are literally dying in that brutal of a way, I don't know, man. I feel like people would wake up and be like, "Okay, this guy is literally like he's got pus just exploding out of his body. I think we should probably close our close the restaurant for a little bit, you know?" But
Yeah.
who knows? I don't know.
And one thing I wanted to add on top of that is, if you uh count God in the acts of nature column, or at least some of what he does, we can look at Revelation again and see uh in chapter 8 there's these judgment events called the trumpets. There's 7 of them, and the first 4 of them destroy like a third of all the trees and all the grass. We see that a third of the water is bitter, or like, I guess, undrinkable. Um and if only those 2 things happened like today, we would be in a tough spot. Like, the air, if like, depending on how quickly all that happened, like if all the trees burned up, like a third of them at least, the air would be unbreathable.
Sure.
It would be bad. And then a third of the water's gone. That's just tough.
Yeah,
That's
I
tough.
mean, we see like when the Flint thing happened and they had their water supply was contaminated, like that was a whole debacle in itself, and that was one city. Flint's not even like that big of a city, you know what I mean? So it's like, imagine if that were to happen, a third is like of the everything. Like, yeah, we would be in a tight squeeze for sure. We would be in a tight. We would not be doing well. So a lot of, but I think the in that situation, the first people to go, unfortunately, like if you're trying to like war game that, a 30% water, one third of the water gone, I think it would be the poor people in, underdeveloped areas that would die first.
Yeah.
Probably, it'd be like the people like we mentioned earlier, the Congo, undeveloped parts of Africa, Southeast Asia, India, like that. They would be the first to go because there's just no infrastructure there, So,
Yeah. I mean, that reminds me of something Jordan Peterson said. He was talking about like the best way to like reduce climate change, in like, from based on past experiences, based on history, has been make the poor people rich,
hmm
because now the rich people are in a position to be like, have the luxury to worry about something like climate change rather than just like getting food for survival. And one of the things, like, the acts of nature, the acts of nature do, are those people like on the borderline of being poor or rich.
hmm
Like, those borderline people are brought into like the poverty column, or now are at like risk of actually dying very easily,
right,
compared to the rich people who can be brought down the same amount and have a car to drive away, or get on a plane to go halfway
right,
across the world where there's good water or whatever. And what factors into that is then the act of nature increases demand and the supply stays the same generally.
right. So then you have
And
shortage,
yeah, we're at a shortage. And now even some of the people above that poverty line, can't do anything, even if in normal circumstances they could.
right, right. Huh.
But pretty powerful stuff,
Yeah,
nature, you
yeah.
know.
No, 100%. I mean, you see just what happened with Turkey. That was Turkey and Syria. Those earthquakes were have you heard about those, right? Just
Yeah, I heard.
devastating, man. Like those were so many people missing under the but you know what the interesting thing was about that is back with the infrastructure, like those places were built those buildings that collapsed on people and stuff like yeah, that was a very strong earthquake, but there are ways to architect buildings that provide a lot more stability in the case of an earthquake. And generally, earthquakes are not just a random. I mean, they are random, but you know if you're at a high risk area or not. Like Georgia, you're at no risk for an earthquake. You're good. California, you're at risk for earthquakes. You gotta like when you're developing and you're building that infrastructure, you need to account for the fact that this is a common occurrence. Japan, they just had an earthquake, I think a day ago or something like that in northern Japan. And they said that they don't think that there's going to be a tsunami yet, but they are prepared because at the end of the day, they know that earthquakes happen all the time. They're at the middle of a bunch of tectonic plates. They know that earthquakes happen, and once the earthquake happens, a tsunami is going to follow up. So at the end of the day, man, like, you got to have a certain level of understanding for your situation and where you are. And I think that just governments need to do better when it comes to taking care of those people, because those people aren't going to be able to. You think these people who got killed in Syria and parts of Turkey are really going to be able to just kind of pick up and go back to normal life? Like, they lost a child or lost their home, lost all their belongings. Like, that's, like you can't expect for these people to be able to take care of themselves. Now they don't have shelter, like with the Jordan Peterson thing. They don't have shelter now. Now what? Now what are you supposed to do?
Yeah, I just
So,
looked it up, and that the death toll in Turkey in Syria combined
mhm.
is like 50,000 right now.
Yeah, it's a lot of
So
people.
it is a lot of
It's a
people.
lot of people. It's really tragic, honestly. But I wanted to ask, if you were to, from your lens, with the United States being the way it is, and you mentioned about kind of us being able to navigate the ship with religious common ground. Let's say it that way, religious common ground. Um, what is your recommendation for how the United States should navigate what is going on now using your past things that you just said? What is our best way forward then? Three
So,
in 3 points, in three main points.
hmm, first point, quit investing in like I know this like pretty much has nothing to do with what I said, but it kind of does with like the self-interest part of things. Like, um, the scripture, like, get the log out of your eye before you go and call out the speck in another's, where it's like, don't judge someone
Right.
else if your shit isn't in order.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't think the US's shit is in order. So, um, I think our self-interest needs to shift a little bit from like this global mindset where we're pouring $500 million into Ukraine and funding wars in Yemen and just like wasting money everywhere else but ourselves.
Yeah.
It's like we're trying to fix everything everywhere else because we're like avoiding the problems here at home,
Yeah.
in our cities and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Um, so that's kind of the first thing that'd be a nice trajectory change. Um, the second thing, I mean, I think we could, if we were like more aligned in our values somehow, like going back to kind of the religious thing, like, you know, I think if between the religious divisions in our country, the political divisions in our country, the wealth divisions in our country, and all these other categories of divisions in our country, we need some sort of shared set of values
Hmm.
that like can kind of rise above the divisions, or else we're not going to steer our ship. Like, it's just going to be the acts of nature. It kind of goes into why we, like, everyone as a country, like, kind of one of those shared values is like, I really hope that Congress is going to be in a stalemate or
Right.
whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. Gridlock.
Yeah,
Yeah.
gridlock.
Brain for good luck. Yeah. Yeah.
So it's pretty odd that like pretty much everyone thinks that in the US, yet we can't seem to realize that everyone thinks that
Hmm.
and use it as like something to come together, or like unite over and finally just freaking steer our ship in a
Right.
good direction.
Right.
And that kind of begs the question, like the third point, where should we steer the ship? Where should we steer the ship? Um, I don't know where we should steer the ship. Do you have any idea?
Right into Beijing. No, I'm just kidding. Probably shouldn't do that.
Like obviously we want economic prosperity.
Sure.
I mean, honestly, I think one of the biggest things we could do is, like Jordan Peterson said, just put money into the poorest people of our society,
Mhm.
right? That'd be a good thing to do, I think. Like make the poor people rich. Um, I think it'd be nice to have education, like an education system
That works.
that, yeah, that works.
Yeah, that would be nice.
Um,
And I think that that is investing in our people. That is investing. The education is what's going to get them prosperity. It's not going to be handing them things or telling them, oh, here you go, I'm sorry, get here's rich, so now you can just focus on learning and getting richer. It's like, no, like you get yourself rich by learning.
mhm,
you know you don't have to be an academic to get rich. You can just get a degree or do a trade, learn, and get rich that way. That's how you do it. Education, if you stay in school, you will do better in life. That's just an overall true statement.
yeah. Yeah, isn't there like a saying like you're likely to like not be in debt or something like that if you graduate high school, uh like don't have a kid until you're married, and like something else. There's like three things.
Hmm. I think I've heard of it before, but I don't know what the other thing is.
Um I don't know what the three things are, but I mean, the one of the other things is handing out money to people
Hmm.
isn't going to make them like have self-discipline or have uh
Motivation.
yeah, motivation and drive to
Yeah.
like go out and not and graduate high school and be responsible with how they have sex,
Sure.
or how they deal with the consequences of sex, right?
Yeah. But all those things are education, right? Like staying in school till you graduate, that is having a self discipline and also external discipline from parents to enforce and
Yeah,
the importance of education. And same thing with sex before marriage and having a kid. Like that's also education, from the parents as well as the school system, basically saying like, hey, no, don't just be having sex with people willy nilly, because you can, if you're not doing it right, which that's a whole other conversation whether or not it's good or not. But if you are going to do it, at least do it the safe way. Now, I don't
yeah,
think you should be teaching kids who are not able to even comprehend what sex is that, but people should know, because that's something that, it's going to ruin their life if they have a kid, especially for the woman,
yeah,
you know? So,
yeah. Uh, so I think all of these things, like kind of the education stuff we were just talking about, kind of
mhm,
goes into a good goal that um actually Paul talks about in one of his letters. But he talks about how he was like self-reliant, like how he was like going into these communities, spreading the gospel, but he wasn't like mooching off of them. He was like, while he was in those communities, he was like working for people. He was like, I don't know, like farming or like doing carpentry. Like Jesus, like I don't really know what he did.
right.
Um, and I think this kind of goes in the log spec metaphor judgment, but it's like we should be working towards self-reliance, without exploitative labor practices,
Sure.
because it like if we as like the US could get our shit together, like we have amazing natural resources, uh we have a, an amazing ability to defend ourselves geographically and based on our military. And if we could just like start producing value again, like in a net positive way, like not going in a deficit and kind of printing our way out of it, I
Mhm.
feel like that would be the overall direction of the ship that I would recommend. What about you?
So I have mine. Mine are really quick, but I wanted to address what you said first. I wanted to kind of go for each one. So when you said involvement in other countries, I think I was trying to think of like some sort of analogy of this the other day, and I couldn't find one that was good. But one that I thought was like, it may sound silly, so bear with me, but it's like a guy who has a dog who's known to be very destructive if he's not present, but he's always out of the house.
Mm,
So it's like he's always working or going out to bars and he knows that his place is a mess and the dog is causing a mess, but he wants to go out and get drinks with friends. He wants to work so long in the office. He wants to do all these things and he wants to ignore the fact that his apartment's a mess because this dog is ruining everything. He needs to spend time with the dog, take the dog out, let out the energy of the dog. So at the end of the day, the dog is like American people. They're known to be very quick to unrest, very quick, and it's always been that way, because of the free nature of our system. But the guys like the government has their interests are not here. Their interests are elsewhere. And at the end of the day, you need to invest in what's here because if you keep ignoring that problem, next thing you know, that house is going to be destroyed. There's going to be nothing left and you're going to have to rebuild it all, pretty much. Like the
yeah.
structure will be there, but everything else will be destroyed. So, and that, because that can quickly pivot to anarchy. So that's one. When you said the religious and values and the commonality here, I think you have two approaches to this. It's either you return to ethics, which is kind of an offshoot of morals because morals are based in religion. Ethics are kind of a secular version of morality. Don't kill other people, don't steal from other people, don't, respect your neighbor, respect authority, whatever. It's a PC way of saying religious values pretty much. So I think
Mm,
that it's either that's one avenue or you could go down the we are going to run this country in really the only applicable way and realistic way in this country would be the Christian manner because just from numbers that would be the most applicable way to do it. But it has to be one or the other, and I think that there's an advantage and a big disadvantage in both. So that's another thing. Where to steer the ship? I think keep the ship at home, keep it docked for now.
yeah, like
You
the
know,
self-reliant thing.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Like keep it here. Keep it. There's no need to take that ship anywhere else. Right now, the issues are here, back home. We got to keep the ship here. Once we've settled these things, then we can talk about helping other people in Ukraine and whatever, and helping Saudi Arabia with the war in Yemen, which is atrocious. But at the end of the day, we have more pressing issues here. So my resolution, my three things are three E's: education, ethics, and enterprise. Three E's.
Mm,
Three E's. You like
enterprise.
that? You like the three E's? I like them.
Enterprise at all? I like the
I
threes.
like the three E's too. I was writing it down. I was like, man, this is genius. No, but enterprise in the sense of like investing in US, again, keeping things at home. US companies, US, like our financial system needs to be more dependent on US equity. Like it shouldn't keep getting more diversified in international portfolios. Like, no, let's keep it here. We need to invest in infrastructure. We got to invest in companies that will actually provide that service, not the government. The government's already tied up in 50 million ways and money strapped in 50 million more ways. So it's like investing in here and what we
Mm.
have going on here so that we are not dependent on other people, because you learn throughout history when one group is dependent on another, that group eventually fails. When the Vikings were dependent on I think it was like the Franks, but it was like Charlemagne's empire. I forget what it was called. It was like the offshoot of after the Romans ended. It was Western Europe's kind of newly founded Roman Empire. And then you had Eastern Europe with the Byzantines. But with Western Europe, the Vikings relied almost exclusively on taking from other people forcefully. Once that empire collapsed on itself, then the Vikings were in a little bit more of a tougher spot, because they these individual places started fortifying and being like, no, you know what? Like, now we are self-reliant. We need to take care of ourselves. So we're going to build these gates and moats and all these things so they can't get to us. So it's like, at the end of the day, when you're so reliant on other people, that eventually will collapse, as all things do. So you're left in a sticky position. So I think the United States, if we don't start relying on ourselves more and we keep relying on others, we're going to be let down in a big way. In a big way.
Yeah. And it's the question of who's the self versus the other,
Sure.
kind of at the end of that. And I think another valid perspective could just be that I heard this said by Marjorie Taylor Greene, which is pretty concerning, one of our representatives, that the red states and the blue states have divided so much that she believes that the red and blue should have a divorce. Like, essentially meaning two different
Like
countries.
seeding. Like,
Yeah.
oh, interesting. So who's
But
going to
like
secede from
but
who?
like both agree. I think that's kind of why it's the divorce, right? It's like both sign off on the arrangement, you know.
That would not be good.
I I don't know. I think it would. I honestly think there is a scenario where if the red states and the blue states divided, if because let's be honest, the blue states, like, they it would essentially be a blue government, a Democrat government, a liberal government to the extreme, right? And the red states would be the Republican government or the Republican beliefs, the conservative beliefs to the extreme. Economically, the red government would do better.
I don't think so. Reason being is because all of our financial like all of our financial hotspots in the United States are all blue states. They have control over all of pretty much centralized finance. Wall
Mm,
Street, San Francisco, like I mean, what these places are huge, huge. There's nothing in red states that could compete to that level of financial dominance. Like, there's no way. Just New York in itself, just New York by itself, is a monster in its own way. And to lose a place like New York City would be catastrophic to the red states, because then that's half of their trading. That's half of it. Like, it's, and you'd have to establish a new hub for financial commerce. And it's like that. Atlanta's not going to do that. Miami's not going to be that. Charlotte maybe, but Charlotte's, North Carolina's like purple, So
mm,
it's like, at the end of the day, I don't think that the red states would do better financially. And then you have to go into the other thing of how are these new countries going to relate with the rest of the world? Then what? If you're isolated from the rest of the world, then you're not going to do well financially. You need to be involved to a certain extent.
mm,
So that's just what I think. But I think when it comes to the individual state, yeah, on the state level, I think red states do better, but it's dependent on the collective. It's dependent on that. So I don't
mm.
think by themselves are going to do that well.
Interesting. Interesting.
Same thing with tech, dude. Where's tech? Not in the red states, except for with the exception of Texas. Not in the red states.
Atlanta's becoming kind of a tech hub. If you think about it, we got Microsoft, Google, Georgia Tech.
Yeah, but that's no Silicon Valley. Not even
Yeah,
close.
but we also I think Silicon Valley is kind of over. I think it's every real tech bro is kind of working remote.
Yeah, but I don't know. It's a tricky thing. Also, give me 2 seconds. I have to use the restroom. I thought I could wait another 15 minutes, but I can't. Well, we'll cut this out. All right, sorry about that. Let's get back into it. So I guess we can cut that, and then I guess you want to talk about these while we have some time left. You want to talk about these determinants, kind of go over them.
Um, yeah, I think one of the most impactful determinants to me was the self-interest one. And I really liked the self-interest addendum on page 81 because it had some cool questions that I don't know, like and a few cool statements that uh give some insight on, where uh is Harvey Dent. No, I'm just kidding. But where Ray Dalio thinks the US is going.
Mm-hmm.
Um One of these statements is on page 83. It says, over the last few years, the world has been moving from being more globalist to being more nationalist. At the same time, the United States appears to be losing its cohesion as people's views about how they should be with each other are becoming more divergent. And actually goes on to say these divergences are leading people to migrate to the states that align with their preferences, causing those states to be more relevant individually than as parts of a unified whole. Pretty interesting that we were just talking about the red and blue states divorce right before that. But
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. One of the biggest questions that I had reading that was, over the last few years, I guess let's think maybe 5 years, over the last 5 years, has the world become more globalist or more like nationalistic?
The past 5 years.
Yeah. Or let's think of when this was written. I think this was written pretty recently, right?
Yeah, very recent. Honestly, I think it's globalism in the name of nationalism. Or I'm sorry, other way around. It's nationalism in the name of globalism.
Mm.
Because like with China doing all of their endeavors in Africa, and they're doing it in the name of globalism, that they're trying to stimulate their economies and improve their education systems and their infrastructure, when in reality it's because of China wants to improve China. And I think that that's the same thing with the United States' position in Ukraine. They're supporting Ukraine because they want to support themselves. There's an end goal here that we may not know, but they know. And that's why they're involved in this conflict. There's an end goal here that they want for
Mm.
themselves. If you really think, when has the United States ever cared about Ukraine? Never. Like literally never
I
until
think
this
we've
situation.
cared like when we were trying to launder money through it.
Yeah, but we didn't care when Crimea was annexed.
We
No one
cared
said
when we
anything.
were instating the government that's
Right. Because it's
currently
in
in
our
Kiev.
interest. In our interest. It's almost like hedging our bets. Like it's like putting in almost like literally almost like a puppet government over there. Like saying, "Hey, really you kneel to us." But that's why we're so invested, is because we've put all this time and money and effort into manufacturing this system that they have. When in reality, historically, this has been part of the Russian sphere of influence since even before the Cold War ever happened, before the USSR. Russia and Ukraine were like big brother and little brother for almost all of history. So
Mm.
it's like, why are we so invested? Why are we sending tanks? That's not a defensive weapon. That's not a defensive weapon. Abrams tanks are definitely not defensive weapons. I'll tell you that right now. I think they're max. It's actually quite impressive. I don't know why I went on this tangent, but um, it's they can hit from 3,000 meters precisely.
So 3,000 meters is what, 9,000 feet? So it's like 2 miles.
Yeah, 2 miles, and then their self-guided missile can be effective more above 8,000 meters. They
Wow.
so if we're saying this is defensive weaponry, we're kidding ourselves. It's not at all, at all. And at the end of the day, if we're really pushing for globalism and everyone to be free and all this stuff, then why are we pushing Russia, specifically Putin? Why are we pushing his buttons like this? Like, this is something that is an act of war against Russia.
Yeah.
So why are we doing this? If we're trying to be globalists and everyone get along and kumbaya, then why are we doing this?
Yeah. It's kind of hard for me. Like, I think one big indicator of if we're actually going for the globalist thing or versus the nationalist thing is like, where is the money and where's the power lie? Like, is the Joe Biden like clearly isn't in control of his own actions?
No,
He's
I
a
don't think he's even.
senile old man.
I don't think he's even in control of his bowel movements, dude.
Yeah, he probably has a he probably has to go empty his bag
Yeah,
every few
yeah.
hours, if you know what I mean.
He's like, I gotta take the pouch out.
um, like, yeah, they have to like drug him up
Yeah,
so he can like read the teleprompter. It's insane. But um, like depending on where the power lies. So like if Biden is in control, who is, and is that same person in control of Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin or all of Europe, like the European Union, like where kind of like I guess the question I'm trying to ask is like where are the actual boundaries of the empires
mm,
versus what does the map say,
sure.
you know? Because like I think there can be an argument for to be made for nationalism, but the nationalism does go like above like the country lines that are currently on the map.
Sure.
So it's kind of like nationalism, but it's also kind of like globalism because the countries are expanding into like countries that span the entire globe. If
Right.
that makes sense.
Right.
And if we think about it, like if 10 countries or 7 countries or whatever it is end up emerging, like eventually the maps are redrawn to represent the actual empires of the people who hold power and have the money
Hmm.
and are funding all the various former countries, then that is going to be a much more globalist environment if you
Sure.
think about it, because it's going to be a lot easier for like there to be a consensus made for the entire globe if there's only like 10 leaders or 7 leaders like
Right.
at the top, or maybe there's like 7 or 10 committees that represent each giant region. But if that were the scenario that's playing out, which I kind of think it is, like I kind of think Mexico, United States, Canada are kind of on their own wavelength, and then European Union is kind of on their own wavelength, but
Yeah.
they're like working with Canada, United States, and Mexico pretty closely.
Right.
Russia and China are kind of on their own. I think the Middle East is currently like that sort of seat is being fought for right now. Middle East, North Africa, South Africa. I have no idea.
I think Middle East is a mixed bag because you have Western support in the Middle East. You have countries that support the West, and then you have countries who do not. And you have countries that support China, and then you have Iran and that sort of thing. And actually, I found a pretty cool map. I'm gonna share it to you now. I'm gonna just share the screen. Um, Check this out. I can't share my screen. Okay.
Wow.
Says I don't have permission. Here, I'm just gonna send this link to you and then see if you can share. I'm gonna put it in the chat box. Gotta love technology.
I love technology.
I do too. I think technology is awesome.
I created my own website very recently, not to plug it right now, but
Really.
uh, that's part of the reason why I have a particular love for technology right now.
Oh my gosh, I don't know why I can't Command C. I think my keyboard's not playing nice with my Mac. There you go.
Okay, let's go there. Share my entire screen. Okay. Bro, hold on. I'm not allowed to share either.
Oh, well, it's okay. It's essentially for everybody watching. It is a map of different spheres of influence as, created by an individual. I'm not sure exactly who made this. But it's basically showing in different colors, what the US and allies, so the quote unquote Western sphere of influence is. It has the Chinese sphere, the quote unquote weak Chinese sphere. So I'm not exactly sure what that entails or what makes it weak. You have Russian sphere, Iranian sphere, and then you have contested, which I guess that means just, not really in anybody's court. But what's an interesting call out here is the fact that Africa, the entire continent, seems to be generally under a Chinese sphere, with the exception of Egypt and Morocco.
Yeah, it's kind of like the Belt and Road
Hmm.
kind of thing.
Like Sudan, Ethiopia, Tanzania. Let's see, Angola there, South Africa, Algeria, Mauritania. Like that's all gonna be weak Chinese allies. And what's interesting about that is that the China, and it doesn't include the Congo, which is really interesting because the Congo definitely is. And another interesting thing is that Ukraine is shown as gray, which means not in anybody's sphere of influence, which doesn't make any sense at all because even if you take it from what's going on now, they are heavily under the Western sphere of influence. They wouldn't be able to fight
Yeah.
this war without the West.
It
And if you
should
look
at
at it,
least be contested.
at least, or historically speaking, they have always been the Russian sphere of influence up until
Yeah.
this war, pretty much Zelensky. So it's like, what? Like what is that about? That's pretty interesting. But I recommend you all check it out. It's under it's called Military Spheres of Influence under r/map porn on Reddit. So
Oh,
definitely check it out.
yeah, this is pretty cool. Um, well, let's see. Do we have any like closing statements, would you say? We're kind of I think we should wrap up here soon.
Yeah.
Closing statements of what we've learned, what we've discussed.
Please, you first.
Um, well, let's see. I mean, so I think going back to the thesis, I think the determinants that Ray Dalio kind of lays out and the relationships they have with each other are kind of like they're intuitive. I think they are reflective of what normally happens in
Hmm.
the real world. Like I feel like he went through some of the cause and effect sort of cycles between the determinants. One of my favorite ones was in the chapter 2 addendum where it's like kind of a mixture of psychological and economic determinants where it's like uh at the beginning of a normal country or empire, the people think they're poor and they're actually poor. Then there's a stage 2, people think they're poor, but they're actually like rich. And
Hmm.
then stage 3, people think they're rich and they're actually rich. And this is kind of the weak point. And then because they kind of get lazy and
Sure.
start, going into debt and stuff like that. And then, once people get comfortable, now their wealth declines. And now we're in stage 4. People think they're rich
They're poor.
and they're actually poor. And then you're back to stage 1 where people think they're poor and actually are poor. Um, so I think, you know, stuff like that and the determinants he laid out are pretty legit. One thing I wish he maybe included was a link to his AI model. He mentioned several times throughout the chapter that he has been using this model, like plugging his determinants into a program. And I haven't seen the program, which makes me kind of sad. Because I'd like to use it.
Right.
But again, like after reading the chapter, I I'm a little sad Ray didn't like expand on why he thinks the machine is perpetual. Um maybe maybe it's as simple as he just used that word to make people like latch on to the idea more or wrestle with it more.
Hmm.
Um which I guess is a valid strategy, but I think it's if the AI model, let's say, was programmed with these determinants under the assumption that the system continues on into infinity, again, that model is going to be accurate up until the end of the system, which could
Sure.
be 1,000 years, 2,000 years, where reality and the model are going to diverge. And then we're sitting here with this book in our hands and no money, or
Right.
that we're gonna suffer because if we subscribe to everything in this book, then there's gonna come a point where the machine isn't perpetual anymore.
Right.
And the model that we use is invalid, and we're going to have no idea what's going to happen. And we can't hedge our bets or prepare for it in any way.
Sure. Okay. Well, I guess my closing remarks would be, I think his thesis about history evolving. I've learned that history is continuously evolving story to inspires like a perpetual motion machine that is driven by cause and effect relationships that both evolve and repeat over time. I think it's true still. I think it holds true. And furthermore, I think that um, our best age, arguably our best age, the 50s, when we had our kind of golden age in our country, post World War II, all this prosperity, it ties in with the three E's. It's because we were operating under, emphasizing education. That's when you have a lot of those children of the baby boomers. I don't know what that generation's called, but they were going to college, going to school, whatever. They were educated. There was an emphasis on ethics, and not just ethics, but there was a common, kind of like we were talking about earlier. There's a common sort of thread in American values, quote unquote, respecting people, working hard, taking care of your children, investing in properties, making sure that you're not only improving yourself and your family, but you are, being a good neighbor, being, I think it's, that was another big emphasis during that time. And then lastly, with enterprise, that was a big boom in business here. Jobs were created. Um, and I think that there's a lesson to be learned there, back with that thesis about those cause and effect relationships that evolve and repeat. I think with the proper stimuli and our emphasis on those three things, I think that this country can adapt to its current situation and almost repeat, because just like how you can repeat bad activity, you can also repeat good activity. At the end of the day, I think that's a really good way for us as a nation, as a people, to repeat that great time in our past and move on accordingly. So that's kind of my little closing remark here. And also, last thing would be, hopefully it's not going to be 5 weeks to the next one. Hopefully it'll be, next weekend. So we'll see if we can make that happen.
Yeah. It was too long between chapter 1 and 2. Luckily, I don't think we posted chapter 1, so
Yeah, you got to do that. That needs to be done.
All right, stay tuned for Two Guys, One Book on Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order by Ray Dalio. Cheers.
We're signing out. Let me stop the recording. Hold on. Yeah, record. Stop.